brought to you by WikiVidi.com. United States presidential line of succession. The United States presidential line of succession is the order in which persons may become or act as President of the United States if the incumbent president becomes incapacitated, dies, resigns or is removed from office. The line of succession is set by the United States Constitution, and the Presidential Succession Act of 1947 as subsequently amended to include newly created cabinet offices. The succession follows the order of Vice President, Speaker of the House of Representatives, President pro tempore of the Senate, and then the heads of federal executive departments who form the Cabinet of the United States, which currently has 15 members, beginning with the Secretary of State. Those heads of departments who are ineligible to act as president are also ineligible to succeed the president by succession, for example, most commonly if they are not a natural-born U.S. citizen. Current order. The current presidential order of succession is as follows. Cabinet officers are in line according to the chronological order of their department's creation of the department, of which their department is the successor. Eligibility requirements. To be eligible to serve as president, a person must be a natural-born U.S. citizen, at least 35 years of age, and a resident within the United States for at least 14 years. These eligibility requirements are specified both in the U.S. Constitution, Article 2, Section 1, Clause 5, and in the Presidential Succession Act of 1947. Acting officers. Acting officers may be eligible. In 2009, the Continuity of Government Commission, a private non-partisan think tank, reported motivation for changes to the succession in 1945. 2 months after succeeding Franklin D. Roosevelt, President Harry S. Truman proposed that the Speaker of the House and the President pro tempore of the Senate be granted priority in the line of succession over the cabinet so as to ensure the president would not be able to appoint his successor to the presidency. The Secretary of State and the other cabinet officials are appointed by the president, while the Speaker of the House and the President pro tempore of the Senate are elected officials. The Speaker is chosen by the U.S. House of Representatives, and every Speaker has been a member of that body for the duration of their term as Speaker, though this is not technically a requirement. The President pro tempore is chosen by the U.S. Senate, and customarily the senator of the majority party, with the longest record of continuous service who fills this position. The Congress approved this change and inserted the Speaker and President pro tempore in line ahead of the members of the cabinet in the order in which their positions were established. In his speech supporting the changes, Truman noted that the House of Representatives is more likely to be in political agreement with the President and Vice President than the Senate. The succession of a Republican to a Democratic presidency would further complicate an already unstable political situation. However, when the changes to the succession were signed into law, they placed Republican House Speaker Joseph W. Martin first in the line of succession after the Vice President. Some of Truman's critics said that his ordering of the Speaker before the President pro tempore was motivated by his dislike of the then current holder of the latter rank, Senator Kenneth McKellar. Further motivation may have been provided by Truman's preference for House Speaker Sam Rayburn to be next in the line of succession, rather than Secretary of State Edward R. Stettinius, Jr. Acting President and President. Article 2, Section 1 of the United States Constitution provides that, in case of the removal of the President from office, or of his death, resignation, or inability to discharge the powers and duties of the said office, the same shall devolve on the Vice President until the disability be removed, or a President elected. This originally left open the question whether the same refers to the said office or only the powers and duties of the said office. Some historians, including Edward Corwin and John D. Feerick, have argued that the framers' intention was that the vice president would remain vice president while executing the powers and duties of the presidency. However, there is also much evidence to the contrary, the most compelling of which is Article 1, Section 3 of the Constitution itself, the relevant text of which reads, "The Vice President of the United States shall be President of the Senate, but shall have no vote, unless they be equally divided. The Senate shall choose their other officers, and also a President pro tempore, in the absence of the Vice President, or when he shall exercise the office of President of the United States." This text appears to answer the hypothetical question of whether the office, or merely the powers of the presidency, devolved upon the Vice President on his succession. Thus, the 25th Amendment merely restates and reaffirms the validity of existing precedent, apart from adding new protocols for presidential disability. Not everyone agreed with this interpretation when it was first actually tested, and it was left to Vice President John Tyler, the first presidential successor in the U.S. history, to establish the precedent that was respected in the absence of the 25th Amendment. Upon the death of President William Henry Harrison in 1841, and after a brief hesitation, Taylor took the position that he was the president, and not merely acting president upon taking the presidential oath of office. However, some contemporaries, including John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and other members of Congress, Whig Party leaders, and even Tyler's own cabinet, believed that he was only acting as president, and did not have the office itself. Nonetheless, Tyler adhered to his position, even returning unopened mail addressed to the acting president of the United States, sent by his detractors. Tyler's view ultimately prevailed when the Senate voted to accept the title president, and this precedent was followed thereafter. The question was finally resolved by Section 1 of the 25th Amendment, which specifies that, in case of the removal of the president from office or of his death or resignation, the vice president shall become president. The amendment does not specify whether offices other than the vice president can become president rather than acting president in the same set of circumstances. The Presidential Succession Act refers only to other officers acting as president rather than becoming president. Thank you for watching. Brought to you by WikiVidi.com. Please like and subscribe below. Please like and subscribe below.